With a general theme of deck building, frequently tied to archetypes, certain cards have slipped through the proverbial cracks and tend to be forgotten. Sadly, some of these cards are actually pretty good. Today's deck build is going to focus on one of those cards, Thunderclap Skywolf. Thunderclap Skywolf is basically a monster version of Lightning Vortex, requiring summons from the graveyard rather than discard. Yeah, there is the side negative of losing the battle phase during the turn this card is summoned, but a vast majority of the time that this card is summoned, it's going to be during your opponent's turn, thereby mitigating the loss of that battle phase, as well as maximizing the destruction of both opponents' monsters and your opponent's play strategy and tempo. With this strategy in mind, drawing Skywolf is not recommended, so 2 copies is the best balance for this deck because it reduces the probability of drawing, but if you only run 1 copy, there's too much potential for it to be removed from play, which will then really handicap the deck. Due to this summoning strategy, 3 copies of Call of the Haunted and 3 copies of Oasis of Dragon Souls are essential, giving you 6 chances to activate Skywolf's effect. I also run 3 copies of a rather situational and old card in Spear Cretin. Most people who even know about or remember this card probably kind of roll their eyes. They tend not to like it, and that's certainly understandable because it's basically a monster version of Shallow Grave, because most of its utility in the past was special summoning flip monsters from the graveyard. But because your opponent gets a monster as well, it's understandably frowned upon. However, in recent years, flip effect monsters have basically become persona non grata, despite attempts to revive them with cards like the Cilia archetype. In this deck, Spear Cretin's a very nice addition because with Skywolf's effect, your opponent's either going to lose the monster they summon because they put it face up, or they're not going to be able to utilize it for the turn they summoned it during their main phase 2 because they're going to have to put it face down to avoid Skywolf's effect. Now, these 9 cards, Call of the Haunted, Oasis of Dragon Souls, and Spear Cretin, are the principal methods for special summoning Skywolf during your opponent's turn. Now we have to focus on how do we dump Skywolf into the graveyard, because that's clearly an important strategy, and it needs the appropriate cards. As a light monster, the chief dumper for Skywolf is Dawn Knight, so 3 copies of Dawn Knight. The quasi-staple Foolish Burial also works very nicely in this deck, so 1 copy of Foolish Burial. Finally, this is a deck that likes milling, but due to the importance of Call of the Haunted and Oasis of the Dragon Souls, I like controlled milling versus the random kind of almost crapshoot that is Lightsworn. Thus, 2 copies of Kuribandit work well. Kuribandit also helps out with Dawn Knight in the sense that if a desired light monster is milled or is in the graveyard from some other means and Kuribandit happens to mill a Dawn Knight, you can place that desired light monster on the top of your deck and get it back next turn. While the key monster and theme of this deck is Skywolf, there needs to be another means towards victory if a player is not able to put this strategy into action. Basically, what are other good cards that can work well with this deck? There are some good options, but when looking at the current monster structure of this deck, lights and darks, the idea of using 1 copy of Blackluster Soldier appears plausible. So what other light and dark monsters should be added? I think a good generic dark monster for this deck is another older monster, Newdoria. When Newdoria is destroyed as a result of battle, the controller can destroy a monster on the opponent's field, not just the monster that attacked. I like the destruction effect of Newdoria, but I can see other people might like to throw in some Skarms for the purpose of getting Spear Cretin or Kuribandit. Because you don't want to remove Skywolf from the graveyard, this deck also is a little light on the light monsters. So adding 3 copies of Star Seraph Scepter and 3 copies of Star Seraph Sovereign work pretty well. Not only do these cards produce their own deck thinning and field presence advantage, but Scepter works well in concert with your revival cards. If you got a Sovereign sitting in your hand and you have a Scepter in your graveyard, you'll have numerous revival cards awaiting just to bring out Scepter, activate its effect, and step right into Sovereign's Effect and get your nice advantage going there. Moving on to spells beyond Foolish Burial. First, of course, the staples: 1 Raigeki, 1 Book of Moon, 2 Dark Holes, 1 Soul Charge. Soul Charge works really well in this deck because it already strips you of your battle phase, so the side effect of losing your battle phase when summoning Skywolf is completely mitigated. 6 traps are already accounted for with the 3 copies of each revival card, but there's still room for the 4 general trap staples: 1 Torrential, 1 Bottomless, 1 Solemn Warning, and again, I'm a guy, I like Compulse over Ring of Destruction. So I use Compulse. If you want to use Ring of Destruction, that's to your taste. What to do if Skywolf is drawn into the hand? Because he is a 2 tribute monster. And this deck, even though it has the 2-star Seraphs, still not really greatly equipped to bring out a 2 tribute monster. Burning Abyss players know there are a multitude of traps that have useful effects, but require a discard. Taking the current meta into account, I like using 2 copies of Divine Wraith over any other discard requirement trap. Another option, though, for I guess you would say kind of a little more risk, a little more reward, would be use Beckoning Light. Send Skywolf to the graveyard and add cards like Scepter or Sovereign to your hand, and then pull off the Scepter Sovereign loop. Finally, with all of the means to special summon during the opponent's turn, interesting tech card I found for this deck that works fairly well is Heatwave. The effect of Heatwave is as followed. This card can only be activated at the start of main phase 1. Neither player can normal or special summon an effect monster until your next draw phase. Now, typically how Heatwave works in this deck is most of the time you're going to activate Skywolf's effect during your opponent's turn, either by flipping a Call or an Oasis during their end phase, or them hitting into a Spear Cretin. Typically you're going to get a clear field. Thus, you're going to have a 2500 attack point monster starting your turn. You activate Heatwave. That's going to prevent your opponent's ability to rebuild his or her field outside of simply setting, which puts your opponent typically in somewhat of a jam position with you having a 2500 attack point monster, and a vast majority of the big tier 1, tier 1.5 decks, they don't like to set. They're not equipped to set. In contrast, when we look at this deck, the monsters in this deck, a number of them don't mind being set. You have Spear Cretin, Newdoria, Dawn Knight. So Heatwave actually has further utility in this deck just simply outside of Skywolf. For the extra deck, there really isn't anything special. Just add your preferred rank 4 monsters, including a few rank 4s that require 3 monsters to take advantage of the Scepter Sovereign combination. I run the following: 1 Evilswarm Ouroboros, 2 Stellarknight Delteros, 1 number 32 Sharkdrake, rank 4 staples, Exciton Knight, 2 copies of number 101, 2 copies of Castel, 1 copy of XYZ Dragon. I run 1 number 103 Ragna Zero, 1 Abyss Dweller, 1 Antiluminescent Knight, 1 Gagaga Cowboy, and I close it out with 1 number 82 Heartlandraco. Overall, I think this is one of the most fun, non-super competitive decks I play. However, just because this deck is fun, do not make the mistake for it not being competitive. Yeah, it obviously won't roll, tier 1 decks, but it can compete somewhat against those decks, and it can definitely compete against the tier 2 decks. So with that, thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.